Hello Year 9, it's Mr. Sandbrook here. I'm going to be teaching you today, and we're going to be looking at the medical developments that were made on the Western Front. So we're going to develop the material that we looked at last time and the limitations of those problems and see what was done to work around them. It should be really interesting stuff. So let's get ready. Grab your history workbook if you haven't already got it next to you. Make sure you've got something to write with, some spare paper for any notes, and get rid of any potential distractions that you've got around you. Just pause the video for a moment and make sure that you're all set up. So here's our Do Now quiz. As usual, try to do this from memory. Don't be tempted to use your knowledge organiser or the previous pages in your workbook. See what you can retrieve from your memory. Just pause the video now and complete these in your workbook. Okay, so let's check those answers. If you need to add any or change any, you can do that in your workbook. And remember to give yourself a mark out of 5. So our lesson today is on the medical advances that were made on the Western Front. So we're going to look at developments in techniques that were made. And we're also going to try to understand why those developments were made. So we're going to understand those causes and then we're going to try to link them together. Before we get into that, let's get our knowledge organisers up to date. So we're going to cover quite a lot today. We're going to focus on some events, but particularly you can have a look at the different treatments for wounds and infection. And we're going to look to complete that section of our knowledge organiser today. So here's our starter. It's quite a tricky one, so let's see what we can do. Here's a list of 6 causes that promoted development on the Western Front. Now I want you to pick just one of them and see if you can tell me how you think it would have promoted change to happen. So you can pick from the nature of the Western Front itself, from the government providing more resources to doctors, surgeons becoming increasingly specialist about the problems that they faced, the issue of new weapons making for new problems, doctors sharing ideas, and lastly, doctors working in teams. See if you've got an idea how just one of those would make development more likely to happen. If you don't want a hint, you can start that now, so just hit pause. If you do want a hint, let's have a look. So maybe think back in our course to when causes like this have been important at other times. So for example, you might think of another time when doctors worked in teams in your course. When did that help? So see what you can do, press pause, and then we'll have a look. So here are some ideas that you might have come up with. So for example, you might have thought that doctors would use ideas that apply to an identical situation. So that's to do with the nature of the Western Front. You might have thought that doctors would have access to equipment and facilities. And that might be to do with the government giving them more resources. Or lastly, you might have thought that doctors would have lots and lots of cases to work on. And that's possibly to do with the nature of the Western Front. Or maybe to do with new weapons making for new problems. So all of these causes promote development. We're going to look in more detail now to look at the developments that happened. So we're going to look at some new content in detail now. At the end of each slide, after I've explained the content, you might like to press pause and make a few quick notes. So our first developments were around infection. Now, gas gangrene was a huge problem. This is where soldiers' wounds were infected, and so as the wound healed, decaying matter would be trapped inside the body and wounds would bubble and pop and fizz. Now, this had happened because when bullets had gone into the body, they'd often carry in mud from soldiers' uniforms or even little tiny fragments of uniforms themselves, which of course would be covered in germs. So this would mean that by the time that operations happened that soldiers needed, wounds would already be infected. So let's look at how this problem was countered. I know that picture on the screen looks pretty gruesome, but it's actually being really helpful. Now what you've got there is the Karel-Dakin method. Now this is where chemicals were flushed through wounds in advance of surgery, and this would buy valuable time to stop infection from setting in. It would often buy up to a week of time. So this would mean that wounds would not be as infected and there'd be a greater chance of the surgery being successful. As the war went on, surgeons also learnt to cut away more tissue from around wounds than they had done before, because on battlefield it was more likely that infection had got in than had previously happened in peacetime. And also, after the first couple of years of the war, surgeons started to become more specialist, and in casualty clearing stations you had specialist surgical teams that were used to working on a specific process. And this of course meant that the quality of their work was improved and there was a greater chance of their work being successful. So as the war continued, fewer amputations were necessary, where limbs needed to be completely cut off to prevent infection from spreading to the rest of the body. So surgery became less intrusive. Okay, our second major development was around blood loss. Now, in the early years of the war, 80% of broken legs that were suffered in the trenches resulted in soldiers dying. And the reason that the soldiers were dying was because they were bleeding to death. You already know that blood couldn't be stored. So this meant that during major battles, there were major shortages of blood, and soldiers that needed transfusions to survive simply couldn't get them in the conditions that they were in. So these problems are all countered in different ways. The image that you've got on your screen is of the Thomas splint. So this was in use from 1916 onwards, and it's a really straightforward piece of equipment. All the splint did was to pull the broken leg straight. But that was crucial because what it did was to limit blood loss. And so soldiers had a much greater chance of surviving the trauma of a broken leg. But crucially, for the longer term importance, doctors worked out how to store blood. Now this was done by using chemicals, by using sodium citrate and glucose to store blood for up to a month outside the body. Now, the impact of this was huge. And by 1917, before the Battle of Cambrai, the British Army set up a blood bank in advance of the fighting. So, when soldiers needed transfusions during operations, the blood could already be on hand. So the first blood bank is crucial. And by the end of the war, broken leg mortality had fallen from 80% down to 20%, and generally effective blood transfusions were possible. So we've got two separate strands here, haven't we? But our broken leg is a narrow First World War trenches condition, but our effective blood transfusions is a long-term wider benefit. Our next development is around facial surgery. The soldiers of the First World War feared being maimed. This could either happen by being shot directly by bullets or by being hit by shrapnel, the small metal objects inside shells. And head and face injuries were common. By 1916, facial surgery was starting to become more common. Skin grafts had been developed in 1915, where healthy skin from another part of the body was used to patch up exposed parts of skin, and specialist hospitals had started to be introduced. The most important of these was the hospital set up by a New Zealand surgeon called Harold Gillies, and he set up the Queen's Hospital back in Britain, which specialised in treating facial wounds. Now, Gillies is sometimes called the father of plastic surgery, and the techniques that he used form the basis of modern reconstructive surgery. So, by 1915, over 11,000 reconstructive operations had been completed. There are other developments too, such as the introduction of the Brodie helmet, which is the metal helmet, which gave soldiers much more protection than the felt caps that they used in the early years of the war. Our final development is around X-rays. On the Western Front, wounded soldiers often had fragments lodged inside their bodies that needed to be traced. So X-rays would be really useful in showing doctors where they needed to operate. But X-ray machines were rare. So the government stepped in. They ordered lots of new X-ray machines to be manufactured, and research and development went on to make the machines lighter and easier to transport. And improvements were so good that mobile X-ray units on lorries and vans were produced, so X-ray equipment could be taken to where it was needed on the front line. So by 1916, most casualty clearing stations had X-ray machines, and all based hospitals had this equipment. You're nearly ready for your main activity. Before you attempt this, make sure you've read through your reading material really carefully. And here's what I'd like you to do. We've got some keywords to define as normal. And then what I'd like you to do is to complete the table, where what you're going to do is you're going to try to link the causes that we looked at the start of our lesson to specific examples of development. See if you can give a short sentence explaining how the cause led to the development as well. So, for example, when did doctors and nurses work in teams more and worked harder together? Think of an example when that happened. For example, Carell and Dakin worked together to get their method researched and introduced. So you might like to take this a bit further. Harold Gillies is one of the heroes of modern medicine, and you can find out more about him using the National Army Museum website. See if you can make a spider diagram about him. Well done, Year 9. We've come to the end of the lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get to know when we publish more videos.